Good morning and welcome to the Cybersecurity Risk Assessment presented by Team 5 for use at the Global Economic Summit. The Cybersecurity Risk Assessment draws from previous research where Team 5 looked at attack vectors, vulnerabilities and threats, and attribution. The purpose of the presentation is to provide perspective on cybersecurity best practices and address organizational security weaknesses introduced by people, technology, and policy that could result in successful exploitation of identified threats and vulnerabilities. Team 5 took a holistic and comprehensive approach to managing authentication, authorization, and access control that formed a sound foundation for cybersecurity best practices. The presentation agenda includes a look at the assets, identified weaknesses, attack vectors, threats and vulnerabilities, attribution, authentication and authorization, access control, countermeasures, recommendations, a conclusion, and then some additional research on vulnerability matrix and the attack vector and attribution analysis. Assets. What's at risk? Our nation's assets, our nation's data and security assets are at risk. That's what we're protecting. We're protecting the nation's critical infrastructure. More and more hackers and attackers are going after sensitive and highly valuable data, and attacks to steal data are becoming more sophisticated and prevalent every day. Since 2010, the government has categorized major cyber attacks on the UK and its interests as a top-tier threat to national security. In the 2 years since the government's national cybersecurity strategy was launched, more than 1,000 cyber attacks have required the involvement of the NCSC, an average of 10 a week. Although most of these attacks will not have affected the UK's critical infrastructure, these figures do include the May 2017 WannaCry attack, which affected NHS services, as well as attacks on the UK and Scottish parliaments in June and August of 2017, and on the energy and telecommunications sectors. Security and government officials are concerned about the vulnerabilities of the UK's critical infrastructure and the threats it faces now and in the foreseeable future. The head of the National Cybersecurity Center has said that a major attack on the United Kingdom is a matter of when, not if. The UK's critical national infrastructure is a natural target for such an attack because of its importance to daily life and the economy. The threat to the UK and its critical national infrastructure is both growing and evolving. States such as Russia are branching out from cyber-enabled espionage and theft of intellectual property to preparing for disruptive attacks, such as those which affected UK's energy grid in 2015 and 2016. The 2017 WannaCry attack, which affected the NHS, also demonstrated that cyber attacks need not target critical national infrastructure deliberately to have significant consequences. In addition, some organized crime groups are becoming as capable as states, thereby increasing the number and range of potential attackers. However, while states continue to be the dominant actors behind cyber threats to the UK, their behavior and apparent motivations are changing. The threats faced by the UK have never been more severe or more pervasive or more potentially damaging to national security. Nation states are stealing business secrets and extensive cyber campaigns targeting commercial secrets around the world, and hacktivism is seeing a resurgence recently fueled in part by the arrest of Julian Assange. Identified weaknesses that could leave our systems vulnerable to attack include people, policy, and technology. While doing the risk assessment, Team 5 identified attack vectors. These attack vectors include mobile devices, weak domain user passwords, SQL injection, buffer overflow, malware and ransomware, memory corruption, TOS flood, SYN flood, ping flood, and viruses. In 2019, we can expect that attacks will take advantage of these attack vectors. A mobile phone, like any other computing device, is a fragile piece of technology, and it needs two types of protection: physical and cybersecurity protection. Frequently, companies invest heavily in external defense capabilities, but fail to adequately protect the internal corporate domain. A common issue is the weakness of password policies, especially when it comes to privileged accounts such as local or domain administrator users. The SQL injection vulnerability is one of the most dangerous issues for data confidentiality and integrity in web applications, and has been listed in the OWASP Top 10 list of the most common and widely exploited vulnerabilities since its inception. In a ping flood, attackers send spoofed Internet Control Message Protocol echo requests, also known as pings, at a high rate from random source IP ranges or by using the victim's own IP address. Most devices on a network will, by default, respond to the ping. If numerous endpoints on the network receive and respond to these pings, the victim IP addresses will be flooded with traffic, rendering their devices and computers and servers unusable. In a type of service flood, attackers falsify the TOS field of the IP packet, which is used for explicit congestion notification and differentiated services flags. A SYN flood is often generated by botnets and is designed to consume the resources of the victim's server. By targeting the firewall or other perimeter defenses, the attacker can overwhelm their capacity limits to bring them down by disconnections, dropping of legitimate traffic packets, or reboot. Threats and vulnerabilities that were identified during the risk assessment include insider and outsider threats, geopolitical risks, cross-site scripting, mobile malware, third-party threats. Some vulnerabilities include people, policies and procedures, unpatched security vulnerabilities, and weak authentication and credential management. More organizations are starting to consider where their products are based or implemented and where their data is stored in terms of cybersecurity risk and regulations. When we have regulations like GDPR and threat actors that emerge from nation states like Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, more and more organizations are beginning to evaluate the intricacies of the security controls of their vendors and their suppliers. More and more they're looking at geopolitical risk as a cyber risk, whereas in the past, geopolitical was sort of a separate risk function belonging to enterprise risk. If organizations do not consider location and geopolitical risk, those that store data in a third party or a nation state that is very sensitive will run the risk of threat actors or nation state resources being used against them. Organizations struggle to avoid cross-site scripting attacks. In the developmental cycle, more than 21% of vulnerabilities identified by bug bounty programs are cross-site scripting areas, making them the leading vulnerability type. Mobile devices are increasingly a top attack target, a trend rooted in poor vulnerability management, according to Forrester. But the analyst firm said many organizations that try to deploy mobile device management solutions find that privacy concerns limit adoption. The biggest security vulnerability in any organization is still its own employees. Whether it's the result of intentional malfeasance or an accident, most data breaches can be traced back to a person within the organization that was breached. One of the most common causes of compromise and breaches for this cybersecurity vulnerability is a lack of sound credential management. People use the same password over and over, and many systems and services support weak authentication practices. During the risk assessment, attribution was assigned to certain nation states. While attribution is difficult to assign, more and more countries are assigning attribution and calling out nation states for their attacks. Iran was one of the states that was identified. Tensions between the UK and Iran in the Strait of Hormuz may be cooling, but online it appears Iranian actors are continuing their activity against targets in the UK and elsewhere. Iran was behind a large number of cyber attacks carried out against the post office, several government networks, as well as UK-based private companies, including banks, just prior to Christmas of 2018. Another country is China. Beijing has been accused of worldwide campaign cyber attacks against the US, Britain, and their allies aimed at stealing trade secrets from governments and high-tech companies in one of the most wide-ranging cases of corporate espionage on record. In addition, the Islamic Republic of Iran and China are standing in a unified front to confront U.S. unilateralism and hegemony in the field of IT. Another nation state that poses a threat is North Korea. North Korea, like Russia, exploits the cyber domain to pursue its foreign policy goals while denying their adversaries the ability to respond effectively. In the past 6 years, North Korea has been held responsible for a number of cyber attacks, causing disruption and financial losses on an unprecedented scale. Finally, Russia. Russia continues with their disinformation campaigns targeting soft democracy targets. UK officials are considering the possibility that a Russian cyber attack was behind a leak of memos which saw the UK ambassador in Washington brand Donald Trump's administration inept and incompetent. But senior Foreign Office figures now believe an enemy government hoping to destabilize relations between Western powers could have been behind it. Authentication and authorization. While authentication, you implement effective password management policies, use pre-boot authentication to protect a mobile workforce and portable devices, use multi-factor authentication, develop auditing and forensic capabilities in your authentication, and then you have a context-based authentication complements a layered approach. When researching the authentication and authorization, I came across a quote that I thought was that explained authentication and authorization well. The quote is that authentication is finite while authorization is infinite. I think what the author means by that is, compared to authentication, authorization can get very complex over time. Authorization rules or requirements change over time or an application's life cycle as business environments needs change. A key concern when using passwords for authentication is password strength. A strong password policy makes it difficult or even improbable for one to guess the password through either manual or automated means. For critical components of the system, organizations should examine the need for pre-boot authentication. This ensures that only selected employees can boot the system and perform administrator-based operations. In addition, you need to develop auditing and forensic capabilities. Audit trails and forensics can facilitate early detection if an organization's system has been breached. Audit trails are effective since they provide information about successful and unsuccessful authentication attempts to the system. Context-based authentication complements a layered approach. Context-based authentication uses contextual information to ascertain whether a user's identity is authentic or not. Based on risk profiles, organizations may limit access to specific systems or content items based on the user's criteria. The main goal of a secure system is to enforce a site security policy to provide accountability and availability. Team 5 does this through access control through multi-level security, mandatory access control, discretionary access control, auditing, and identification and authentication. Before we talk about the access control, mandatory access control, and access control through multi-level security, we first need to briefly look at subjects and objects. Subjects are entities that require access to system resources. Examples of subjects are human users and started procedures. Objects are system resources, is a system resource to which access must be controlled. Examples of objects include datasets, commands, terminals, and printers. Providing access to services for a wide array of people can prove daunting for any IT team. Users require unimpeded access to critical network infrastructure, but they also present potential vulnerabilities. As the risk of breaches grows, so too does the demand for network access control solutions to mitigate the risk. Multi-level security, also known as label-based access control, allows you to classify objects and users with security labels. The security labels are based on hierarchical security levels and non-hierarchical security categories. Multi-level security solution uses the multi-level security features of the operating system. It prevents unauthorized users from accessing information at a higher classification than their authorization. It also prevents users from declassifying information. Mandatory access control is a system-enforced method of restricting access to objects based on the sensitivity of the object and the clearance of the user. By contrast, discretionary access control is enforced by individual file owners rather than by the system. Discretionary access control is implemented using access control lists. A resource profile contains an access control list that identifies the users who can access the resource and the authority, such as read or update, the user is allowed in referencing the resource. The security administrator defines a profile for each object, a resource or group of resources, and updates the access control list for the profiles. This type of control is discretionary in the sense that subjects can manipulate it because the owner of a resource, in addition to the security administrator, can identify who can access the resource and with what authority. Audit records associate a security relevant event with the user who caused the event to take place. In a multi-level secure environment, the audit record must also indicate the security label of an object when a subject accesses, creates, or deletes the object. The system auditor must be able to select for auditing those events necessary for efficient analysis. This selection includes auditing a user's actions either by the user's identity or by the security label of the accessed object. Countermeasures. Some of the countermeasures that are going to be used to mitigate the threats and vulnerabilities identified by Team 5 include employee cybersecurity awareness training, multi-factor authentication, defense in depth, policy of least privilege, and mobile device management. An educated employee is likely to fall for phishing schemes than one who doesn't know basic cybersecurity protocols. Cybersecurity awareness training helps to provide employees with the basic knowledge they need to identify and avoid phishing attacks. Using multiple authentication methods such as biometrics, one-use texted codes, and physical tokens for giving users access to your network makes it harder for attackers to hijack user accounts with just the username and password. Using a defense-in-depth approach to network security adds extra layers of protection between each of the individual assets on the network. This way, if attackers bypass the outermost defenses of the network, there will still be other layers of protection between the compromised asset and the rest of the network. Enacting a policy of least privilege means restricting a user's access to the minimum amount needed to perform their job duties. This way, if that user's account privileges are misused, the damage will be limited to risk acceptance. Risk acceptance must be a conscious decision, not a default action due to a lack of information or desire to act. Team 5 identified risks in the risk assessment analysis, and risks that are going to be mitigated include risks to data exfiltration, risks from mobile devices, authentication and access control risks, human and social engineering threats, and system configuration risks. Accepted risks are geopolitical risks. In conclusion, the risk assessment looked at assets, weaknesses, threats and vulnerabilities, access control, authentication and authorization, countermeasures that were used to mitigate the weaknesses, threats, and vulnerabilities, and then recommendations. In addition to the risk assessment, cybersecurity risk assessment, Team 5 put together a vulnerability matrix and an attack vector and attribution analysis. As mentioned earlier, the vulnerability matrix includes additional vulnerabilities and threats that were identified by Team 5 that could pose a potential risk to the network during the Global Economic Summit. The attack vector and attribution analysis looks at the background of attack vectors and attributions. It looked at information technology, the CIA triad, which is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. It looked at attack vectors and hackers, and again, attribution. Thank you for attending this presentation.